Welcome to this special Bloomberg podcast with me, Caroline Hepker, and alongside our finance reporter, Will Shaw. Now, it has been 30 years since Barings Bank, Britain's oldest merchant bank at the time, collapsed after 28-year-old derivatives trader Nick Leeson racked up and concealed $1 billion of trading losses at Barings' Singapore office. Leeson became the face of financial misconduct. He served more than 4 years in Changi prison. He wrote a book, Rogue Trader, that was then turned into a Hollywood movie. In the decades since then, Leeson's been on the speaker circuit talking about what he calls the most embarrassing period in his life. He's owned a football club in Ireland along the way, and more recently his work to investigate financial misconduct. And Nick Leeson joins us now today. Welcome, Nick. Good morning.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I want to have a discussion because, of course, it is 30 years now since the collapse of Barings.
Yeah.
How do you think about that whole period in your life, the impact that it had both on Barings and also on you with that distance now?
Yeah, well, I think you summed it up perfectly in the beginning. It's still with huge embarrassment on my part. You go through, you know, a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, embarrassment at the time. But the one that stays with you is the embarrassment, because it's the complete opposite of what I wanted to achieve. And up until a certain point, I'd had a fairly good career in the world of banking, and then it all imploded very, very quickly when I was in Singapore. So I was, you know, very much the ascending star for a short period of time, and then had a very spectacular fall from grace. And that still sits with you. You can recover from a personal perspective, but you still look at that period of my life and am I comfortable with it? Am I at peace with it? Absolutely not, because that just wasn't me and what I wanted to achieve. But it's always going to be the piece of baggage that I carry around.
You were the star trader sent from London to Singapore. You made the bank a lot of money. Over the years, you built up positions, particularly in the Nikkei. At what point did you know that the cover-up of the trades couldn't be hidden anymore? Like, what was the key moment when you knew it was going to unravel?
It's very difficult to put an absolute definite answer on that. I think I was always, as deep as I was getting into the situation, as bad as it was getting, you're always looking for this slight positive. You know, maybe the market had turned around a little bit, or you'd managed to overcome a particular investigation from somebody within the bank, and that always gave you the belief that you had a little bit more time to try and solve the situation, which is really all I was ever interested in doing. You know, I know I should never have got into the situation, but as soon as I was in it and it was getting worse, all I wanted to do was solve it. So you'd grab these positives, and when you look back with hindsight, they're all false positives, but they just convinced me that I had a little bit more time to try and turn the situation around. And, you know, there were no barriers or controls to what I was doing, and I was never pushed back on at all in terms of how far I could take it, unfortunately.
And I mean, you fled at one point, didn't you? And you went to Kuala Lumpur, and even at that point, according to your book, you didn't think that the bank was going to collapse. No. I mean, as a young trader working in Singapore, you know, the last thing that, you know, I was interested in was what was the capital base of the bank. You know, that was a different area. You know, the Treasury would look after the capital base of the bank, how the reporting was done to the Bank of England at the time, and what were the legal limits you could lend to a subsidiary. They weren't something that I thought about. If I phoned Treasury and I asked them for £50 million or $50 million or $100 million, if they paid that over to me, you know, that was the end of the transaction. How it impacted on the rest of the organisation in terms of the capital base and how much it was lending to a subsidiary, you know, they weren't processes or thought processes that I was going through. You know, when you look back at the story, and I had £650 million with me in Singapore. The capital base of the bank was only 250 million. Legal limit you could lend to a subsidiary is 50. And you were because you were in charge of the office in Singapore, right?
Yeah, but I didn't have access to the money. You know, I still had to refer to a treasurer in London to ask for the money, and then he would pay the money over. I'd give him nonsensical reasons for the money, you know, and was definitely concealing the real reason for needing the money at that time. But the fact that it went past so many
limits and regulatory limits in terms of 20% of the bank's capital being lent to a subsidiary, I was in 13 times in breach of that. But the Treasury Department allowed that to happen. It doesn't take away any of my guilt or my responsibility, but, that's part of the processes that should have been in place to stop this sort of thing happening.
Do you recall the specific time when you started to turn your life around afterwards?
After the collapse of the bank?
Yeah, and after your time in prison and all the repercussions, what was the kind of key turning point for you in rebuilding?
I don't know if there's I don't know if there's a key turning point. I think it's a slow process. When you're in prison and you're looking at everything that you've done and you've been involved in, you go through this process of really pulling back the layers of what's happened, and you have to really have a long, hard look at yourself. You get to a situation where you dislike a lot of the things that you've done, which was obvious. But then at some point, and it's probably a couple of years after release, you have to start looking at yourself and protecting yourself. So it becomes about looking at or building back up your self-esteem, your self-worth, your self-confidence. And that comes through, one of the ways that I suppose it's worked for me over the years is being fairly open with the world's media.
Yeah.
I've never been combative in terms of, people looking for me for a story. I prefer, and I should have started this a lot earlier, I know that, but, I prefer to be very honest and very open book about things that happened and, the ways that I reacted to things during that period.
But there is still a tension, isn't there? And I think this is also why your story, even now, is so fascinating to so many people in finance, which is that tension between the rogue trader, and others have mentioned this, like Jerome Kerviel. He's talked about he made enormous losses for his bank a few years ago, in the billions, and he talked about being scapegoated versus the kind of controls that should be in place. And there's that tension there, isn't it? How much responsibility is on the individual versus actually the oversight that should be there.
And it's a combination of the two. I think anybody who describes themselves as a scapegoat is lying, right? You know what you're doing, you know you shouldn't be doing it, you continue all the same, and therefore you're responsible and you need to take responsibility for your actions. A lot of the other rogue traders that you can mention, Kwaku Adebole, Jerome Kerviel, Iguchi at Daiwa, there's probably too many to mention. A lot of them talk about pressure to perform. Again, it's rubbish. This is a decision between right and wrong, and you know that it's wrong from the beginning, and you know that you're going down the wrong path, and you continue for various reasons. And I prefer to focus on the reasons rather than trying to blame somebody else. It's a shortcoming in my personality as much as it was with Kerviel and Adebole. They took the wrong path, they made the wrong decision, and they covered up from that particular point. Yes, the bank has a responsibility to make sure that they have systems, controls and policies in place. And the fact that they're negligent doesn't take away your guilt, I don't think. So we sometimes we have a difference of opinion with in terms of how the other rogue traders view some of these things.
Looking back at the reporting at the time, it seems like there was a strong kind of class dimension in some respects as to what happened. You came from Watford, you were the son of a plasterer, you rose very fast through the ranks. As you depicted it, the leaders of Barings were sort of posh, foolish, not in control of the company that they were running. To what degree was class part of that story? And do you see, is that route still there for people to rise high and fast in banks like that today?
Well, there is. If you're successful, you're gonna succeed in any business. I think sometimes the trajectory is a bit quicker within the world of banking, but the whole class element of it, which comes through in the first chapter of Rogue Trader, is probably the part of the book that I just don't agree with. But I was stuck in prison in Germany. I had massive legal bills that need to be met. So when I was co-author in the book with Edward Whitley at the time, he wrote that chapter. And it was very keen, or the publishers were very keen that was, that whole part of it, the class conflict, if you like, was embellished through that first chapter. So it's not something that I ever really felt. I was always
You know, I always enjoyed at the week. Like, I never spent. So let me rephrase that. I never spent a lot of time in the city socialising with the people that worked in the city because they weren't really my type of people. You know, I grew up on a council estate in Watford, and I used to like going back home at the weekends to go out with my friends rather than spending my time in the city. For me, it was very much a job of work, and friends that I made in the city at the time were always quite transient. And I think it is a transient industry as people move and push on within that. So there wasn't, you know, I just don't agree with the class element or class warfare element of it that is depicted in the book, and some of the media made a big story of at the time. It's just not the way that I felt. I always felt very welcome. I was very socially adept, which I think was in my favour throughout that whole period, enabled me to move in some of the circles that I did and transgress some of the rules that I did throughout that period as well. But yeah, no, look, I never felt it was, you know, working class versus upper class scenario, which was maybe made a bit more of at the time.
At the time, yeah, it was certainly a feature, wasn't it, in the reporting and in the book, as you say. But that idea of that trajectory, I mean, you left school. I think you left school at 18. You certainly didn't go to university. You went straight into a bank, not Barings, to start with. You had a couple of different jobs before you got to Barings. Yeah. But that kind of route in the city, I mean, even the kind of type of trading that you were doing, it's the open outcry. All of that is it's disappeared.
Yeah,
it's a thing of the past, isn't it? But is that route still open, of that kind of coming into the city and being able to make it?
No, I think it's a far harder route these days, and I think if you go back to that period, if you look at, you know, I started work in the city in 1985, so you've got Big Bang, 1987, so you've got lots of new banks coming into the city. They're all looking for staff, so you used to get off of the tube at bank, and you'd be handed one of those, you know, little magazines, and it'd be full of jobs, and you could quite easily change a job every couple of weeks if you wanted to, with a tiny bit of experience. And, you know, that was enough to give you that opportunity to move into another organisation. So I was 2 years at Coots & Company just down the road here, you know, moved to Morgan Stanley, worked for Morgan Stanley for 2 years, and then was headhunted to Barings. It was, you know, there was lots of opportunity, and I think you can't take that away from some of the things that happened during that period. You know, you've got this process of deregulation where everything is, you know, ramping up in terms of how big the city is becoming, and how many people are working in the city. And, you know, the systems, the controls, the policies weren't in place in some of those organisations in order to safeguard it.
Do you feel like systems and controls are better now, and that there are more safeguards in place to prevent this kind of thing?
Yeah, 100%. You know, like I speak at lots of different events and conferences where, you know, compliance, risk management, governance are the theme, and, you know, you can't underestimate how many people work in those areas now. You know, like when I think back to my time at Barings, we had one compliance officer. I think she was also the risk manager for 2,500 people. You walk into most offices now in Canary Wharf or around this area, and there's 3,000 people working in compliance. So, you know, it's come on in massive leaps and bounds since that time. The quality of people are better. They're better educated. You know, they're getting better training within those organisations. But when you still have an episode like Macquarie happening within the last 2 years, where there were 450 fictitious trades, you have to question how on earth that happens.
And now, I suppose now the Trump administration is looking to deregulate quite fast. There's potentially new risks going to emerge around things like AI and crypto. I mean, do you worry about the regulatory environment and the level of risk?
I don't worry for me. You know, maybe I think there's a worry for the markets. You know, there's always these niche areas that throw up anomalies. So you've got, you know, you had the episode with Archegos a few years ago. You've got Credit Suisse, who've gone by the wayside over the last number of years. You've got this thing that's happened with Macquarie. So is it 100% safe? Absolutely not.
But we're also we're at an interesting point, aren't we, in terms of the Trump administration wanting to roll back the financial crisis era regulations, and that is going to surely put pressure on the UK and on Europe to do the same. And for Britain, it's very much about trying to, financial services has been quite unloved for around Brexit and for quite a long time. Now it's perhaps needed in order to boost economic growth in Britain. So, is there a concern that is, going to become more of a dominant theme again? How do you get a grip of that?
Well, I think the elastic band went too far in the opposite direction when you had the global financial collapse and you've got Dodd-Frank and everything else that came in around that time. The controls were just too much, and that restricted a lot of business getting done. And I think, there's definitely a need to pull back a little bit on that. And you've seen that happen over the last number of years. Whether you're going to go to full deregulation, quite how far it's going to go, is going to open certain doors to allow things to go wrong again. And you've got to be very, very careful when people talk about deregulation. That throws me back to that period in 1987 when I was starting in the city, and it was all of that opportunity. The opportunity to move into the city, get jobs, move on within the different organisations. But also the controls, the systems weren't good enough. If you're getting that right and the industry is perfectly safe, then deregulate and pull back on some of that regulation. But Macquarie is the one that worries me. How can you have 450 fictitious trades? It is just so basic an oversight. This is like kid stuff. And yet you've got an organisation that's missed 450 trades. They haven't reconciled them. They've not been able to see that they're not been able to guarantee any of those trades, yet this has happened less than 2 years ago.
And I'm sure that Macquarie would want to defend themselves on that point and give their explanation.
I'm sure they would want to, but they wouldn't be able to. They are fictitious trades. The key is in the word fictitious. They didn't exist. So how did you allow them to survive as an offset for a young trader within your organisation for so long? That's why you get fined.
Do you think what happened there is a sign of wider risks that are there in the industry, and that's just the tip of an iceberg, or do you view that case in isolation?
No. I think it's an isolated case, as was Barings all of those years ago. Now you've got a number of rogue trading episodes that spun off of the back of Barings and came to light because of Barings. You've got Hamanaka at Sumitomo, Iguchi at Daiwa. These were going on at the same time, so it wasn't an isolated incident. I think Macquarie is an isolated incident, but, one incident is too many. Maybe I shouldn't use Macquarie's name so much.
One of your jobs is to investigate financial misconduct via red mist.
Yeah.
What does your work there involve?
Well, my part of the work is probably more forensic. It goes back to, looking at what my skill sets were when I worked in Coots and Morgan Stanley, and just looking at data and conversations and other things that are going on where there is some misconduct within organisations, and just pulling all that together. I've always thought that I had a fairly photographic memory, so I'm using that again. And just pulling those strands of information and seeing where we can expose misconduct within organisations.
And where are you finding is the most prevalent place for that kind of misconduct? Like, where are the weak links?
It's all over the place, really, to be honest with you. We look at some things which involve a certain amount of sexual harassment. There are certain episodes where that comes to the fore. We're seeing that being quite prevalent at the moment. We look at other cases which have resulted maybe in some trading episodes that aren't correctly following procedure, where there's a lack of surveillance over some of how those trades are being followed through the organisation. It's really quite widespread, and it's quite interesting, and it's good for me, and I'm enjoying it at the moment.
So, back to financial services. In terms of the UK regulator, we've seen, for example, the SEC chair go in the US. There has been some pressure on the FCA chair, and there's always criticism of the UK regulator. Back when it was the FSA, you were quite critical of it in your historic case, but you've also been critical of it recently in the kind of FCA guise. How much robustness is there for the FCA? The regulators always are quite criticised. They're often also quite underfunded in lots of ways, and are limited in their scope, for example. How do you think the UK's regulatory system is measuring up now?
I think it's improved a lot. I think there needs to be, there needs to be more communication and conversations with the banks. They need to work together. I think different regulators are better at doing that. Allying with some of the banks and bringing better controls to the fore. I'm not sure, obviously I'm a million miles away from regulation these days. I would have been a bit closer to it all of those years ago. But, it's still a job of work to be done. They're always slightly behind the curve. That's always going to be the case. I think if you look at the number of people who work in the FCA and how many people work in the City of London, there's a huge disparity. So it's very difficult to man-mark what's going on within those organisations. So you need the banks to get it right. And you need the banks to have robust, tough controls within their own organisations. And then when people do step over the line, when they do commit fraud or they do something that's wrong, they need to be punished. And, there's been a bit more of that over the years. And you hear of more and more cases. But it does still happen. But I think the banks are catching it far quicker. The FCA has a role within that, but there's still a job of work to be done.
When you're brought in to talk to corporations about your experiences, is there a particular piece of advice that you give to them?
The piece of advice is really easy, and it's, I deliver the same piece of advice to my children as well. If you find yourself in a difficult situation, always ask for help and advice. I was surrounded by people that could have helped me. But I didn't do that really simple thing. And, it's a very different world today than it was in 1990s banking. Asking for help was seen as a sign of weakness. And you probably would have been just, not dismissed from the firm, but dismissed with it quite easily. But you should have seen it, or at the time, I should have seen it as a sign of trying to do things correctly. And it's such a simple thing. And, as I explain it to my children, if they find themselves in a difficult situation, just come to me and tell me what's going on. There might be a difficult period, but I'll help you through it. And that's what I needed at the time. And I think, just more communication is such an important tool.
Nick, can I say, you've had such a colourful life. You've written a couple of books. You've been, as I said, to jail. You've been, widely understood as a kind of rogue trader, a sort of poster person for that. And yet you've done so many things since then. Do you sort of mourn the life that you might have had that not happened? How do you, put it into perspective now, 30 years later, and you're still talking about it, still sort of attached to the financial industry. I wonder how do you think about it?
They probably don't like the attachment, but no, it's a very real story. It happened. There's no way that you can avoid that. Unfortunately, you do see certain facets of it coming back into not always just the financial services industry. I think businesses and industries outside of the world of finance have had to pick up on compliance, risk management, government. You've got huge failures over the last number of years, Carillion and episodes such as that. So everybody's had to up their game in that regard. I don't specifically go into these organisations and try to give advice. I feel a bit fake if that was the process. I go in and I tell stories. I can go through in fairly close detail or extensive detail about what happened during that period, because nobody really knows it better than me. And if that then leads them to look at something quite differently within their organisation, then I think that's of a benefit. I also colour compliance and risk management parts of learning within those organisations, because it's usually fairly dull and most people try not to attend. So bringing me in makes sure they get a few more bums on seats, and there's a reason to why you're learning this and why you need to do this properly.
Okay. I suppose a last thought: if there is another Nick Leeson out there now, what would you say to him or her?
Stop. It's not worth it. I remember doing a Treasury Management conference in the Barbican, a good few years ago now, and one treasurer came over to me and he said, "Look, I'd like to ask a piece of advice." And I started off by saying, I'm not sure I'm the right person for that, but I'll do my best to respond as honestly as I can. And he said, "There's a bit of an issue," and it was for one of the biggest UK banks at the time. He said, "I've got a bit of an issue. I'm not happy with something that's going on within the organisation. I've got an email in my outbox that I want to send, but I just don't have the courage to send it at this time. What do you think I should do? And I said, look, I don't know the specific instance, but the one piece of advice I can give you is it's far easier to get another job. It's not so easy to get another reputation. And, you've got to make the right decision on that basis. Unfortunately, my reputation might be slightly different than it was back in 1995 when the story came to everybody's attention, but it's still a bad reputation.
Okay, yeah, no, that's interesting that you feel that you're still very much stuck with, even though you did the prison time, and it's a long time ago, you still feel that you're really saddled with it.
Yeah, I think people have asked me if I'm, comfortable or content with that particular period of my life. I never will be. Because it's the complete opposite of what I wanted to achieve. Am I content with myself? Yes. What I represent, my family values and everything else. But the focus is very different. It's not on being successful and succeeding within the world of finance, which is what I wanted to do. So, you have to change your focus a little bit, and that enables you to move forward. Whereas, speaking about it so openly, honestly and regularly means that it's not this big ogre that follows me around all of the time. It's part of my life. It's part of who I am today, but it's not, it doesn't quite have the level of shame, guilt and embarrassment as it did years ago, but it still has a certain amount of embarrassment.